Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Hercule Poirot as he's invited to a seance unlike any other, one held in a mansion, where superstition runs deeper than truth. The crystal ball stood at the center of the table, flawless, gleaming, until it shattered in the middle of the ritual, without anyone touching it. The lights went out, the room fell silent, and when they came back on, one of the guests was dead. Stay with me till the end, because this isn't just about a broken crystal, it's about a secret that was never meant to be seen. So, pour yourself a cup of tea, and step into the darkness, because tonight's mystery might just reveal more than anyone bargained for. Chapter 1. The inciting incident. Evening was draped in the soft glow of gaslight, the flickering flames casting long, quivering shadows across the opulent interior of the Marlowe estate. The air was thick with the hum of quiet conversation, the clink of delicate crystal glasses, and the unmistakable scent of expensive perfumes mingling with the musty aroma of old wood. It was the height of the London season, and the drawing room was filled with the city's elite, their laughter and chatter filling the air like the music of a well-tuned orchestra. Yet, beneath the surface of polite conversation and genteel civility, there simmered an undercurrent of something far darker. Lady Marlowe, the hostess, was not one to allow her guests to suffer boredom for long. A woman of particular tastes and a flair for the dramatic, she had arranged an unusual entertainment for the evening. A renowned fortune-teller, Madame Zoraia, was to provide a glimpse into the future using her crystal ball. The ball itself was a thing of exquisite beauty, an intricately carved sphere of pure glass, its surface glimmering in the soft light. It was said to have been passed down through generations of Zoraia's family, a rare heirloom with a reputation for revealing the deepest, most hidden truths. As the hour grew late, and the guests grew increasingly merry with wine, the room quieted, and the guests gathered around the fortune-teller. Madame Zoraia, with her deep, penetrating eyes and flowing black gown, sat before the crystal ball, her hands raised in a gesture of ceremonial reverence. She muttered something under her breath, the words a language none could understand, and then placed her hands upon the sphere. A hushed murmur ran through the crowd as they leaned forward, eager for what she might reveal. But what came next was not what anyone expected. The crystal ball cracked open with an ear-splitting shatter, sending jagged shards of glass flying in every direction. Madame Zoraia screamed a shrill, piercing sound that echoed through the room before she slumped forward, her eyes wide with horror. For a moment, the room was frozen in shock. The music of the evening had turned into an eerie silence, broken only by the soft tinkling of the remaining shards of glass as they scattered across the marble floor. At first, the guests thought it was merely an accident. Perhaps the fortune-teller had overexerted herself, or maybe a sudden draft had disturbed her work. But when Lady Marlowe's personal maid, Ellen, screamed and rushed to the fallen woman's side, a dreadful realization began to spread through the room like a contagious fever. Madame Zoraia was dead. Her face was pale, her mouth slightly agape, and her eyes wide open. But there was no breath left in her body. Her hand, still resting near the shattered crystal ball, was stained with dark crimson blood. Panic rippled through the gathering, and chaos erupted. Guests began to murmur among themselves, some retreating toward the door in fear, others kneeling by the lifeless body in a futile attempt to revive her. But amidst the disorder, one thing became clear: the fortune-teller had not died of natural causes. No, something more sinister had occurred. A single question hung in the air: who had killed Madame Zoraia, and why? The authorities were called in, but they seemed slow to arrive, and in the meantime, the guests were left in disarray. It was only when the constable, who had been sent to maintain order, arrived that the weight of the situation began to settle. Lady Marlowe, flustered and still reeling from the shock of the event, insisted that the guests be questioned, but no one had a clear explanation for what had happened. In the confusion, no one noticed the subtle rival of the one man who could solve the mystery. Hercule Poirot, the famed Belgian detective, had been a late rival at the party. Having received an invitation only the day before, his presence had been understated. He was known for his humility and penchant for observing the smallest details. As always, Poirot had come alone, his neatly pressed suit and his perfectly coiffed mustache a stark contrast to the disheveled chaos around him. Yet despite his calm demeanor, Poirot's mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the evening's events like a master puzzle solver. Poirot's eyes scanned the room methodically, taking in every expression, every shift in posture, every whispered conversation. It was immediately clear that something far more complicated than a simple accident had taken place. He could already sense the hidden motives, the subtle contradictions that would form the foundation of the mystery. He approached the body of Madame Zoraia, noting the lack of any obvious signs of violence. Her death seemed to be the result of something far more insidious. Poirot's gaze shifted to the shattered crystal ball. It was impossible to ignore the symbolism of the event. It wasn't merely an accident. It was a message. "Ah, mon ami," Poirot murmured to himself, his sharp mind racing. A riddle within a riddle, a game that has only just begun. With a final glance at the room full of suspects, Poirot stepped forward, his mind already working on the puzzle that lay before him. He knew that he would have to break through the web of deception, uncover the hidden motives, and expose the truth. It was, as always, a matter of understanding the psychology of each person involved. And Hercule Poirot was a master of the mind. The game was on. Chapter 2. The first clue. Poirot stood over the lifeless body of Madame Zoraia, his mind already whirring, analyzing every detail of the scene. The guests had begun to disperse in small groups, their nerves frayed, whispering about the shocking turn of events. But Poirot was not concerned with their hysteria. He was focused on the facts. The crime had occurred, and it was his task to make sense of it. As the constable began directing the guests away from the scene, Poirot took a moment to examine the body. Madame Zoraia lay where she had collapsed, her thin black gown draped around her in a pool of stillness. Her expression was frozen in a look of terror, but it was not the look of someone who had been murdered violently. No, the look was that of someone who had been taken by surprise, as if she had not expected to be a victim at all. Poirot crouched beside her, taking note of the small details. There were no marks of struggle on her body, no bruises or cuts. Her face was pale, save for a faint red stain along the side of her mouth, a small trace of blood that suggested something far more insidious had taken place. Poirot's fingers hovered over her wrist, but there was no pulse. She had been dead for a short while, but it had not been sudden. The realization settled upon him like a slow, cold tide. An experienced woman. Poirot murmured softly to himself, noting the lack of defensive wounds. He straightened, and his gaze shifted to the shattered crystal ball that lay several feet away. The sharp fragments of glass were scattered across the floor, like the remnants of some broken illusion. The ball, once whole and gleaming with mystical promise, was now reduced to shards of its former self. It seemed almost deliberate, as if the destruction of the glass was symbolic in some way. He stood for a moment, contemplating the oddity of the situation. What kind of murder was this? Who would kill a fortune teller, someone so obviously vulnerable? But then, as always, Poirot's mind turned, seeing beyond the obvious. "Mon ami," he whispered to himself, eyes narrowing as he turned toward the group of guests who stood nearby, murmuring nervously, "There's more to this than meets the eye." Lady Marlowe, still pale with shock, was now accompanied by her butler, a stern-looking man who kept his distance from the body. Poirot approached them quietly, the noise of the crowd growing softer as he spoke. "Madame Marlowe," he began, his voice calm but precise, "I must ask you to assist me in gathering the guests. We shall need to question everyone, you see. There are details that will help me understand this tragedy." Lady Marlowe nodded silently, too stunned to argue, and motioned for the others to step away from the body. Poirot's sharp eyes darted back to the shattered crystal ball. He had a sudden, nagging feeling that it held the key to understanding what had transpired. He bent down and picked up one of the larger fragments from the floor. There, embedded in the smooth edge of the glass, was something unexpected, a small but unmistakable smear of ink. It was subtle, a detail easily overlooked, but Poirot's mind grasped it immediately. "Aha," he murmured. "There's a tale to be told here." He examined the ink closely, noticing its position in relation to the rest of the shards. The pattern it formed was odd and natural even. The ink had been smeared onto the glass in a way that suggested deliberate contact, not just an accidental spill. It was as though someone had been handling the crystal ball and in the process had left a trace of something they had not intended to be seen. Poirot's eyes flickered to the guests now assembled in a cluster near the back of the room. They looked lost, bewildered, yet each one seemed to carry a certain guilt and unease that hung in the air like smoke. The room was heavy with suspicion, and Poirot knew that it was time to begin his examination. As the constable stood off to the side, ensuring no one left, Poirot turned to him and said, "Gather the guests. We shall begin with their statements, one by one. No one leaves until we understand the full picture. I suspect that the truth is not far from this very room." The constable hesitated for a moment, glancing nervously at the body. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. But what of the fortune teller? Her death was so sudden. Surely there must be more." Poirot raised his hand, silencing the man. "Ah, my dear constable, there is always more. But for now, we shall focus on what is before us. The truth is never as simple as it first appears." The guests were ushered into the drawing room, their faces ranging from fear to confusion, but all with the same underlying suspicion. As Poirot observed them, his mind worked through the puzzle. Each of them had a reason to be nervous. The question was, who had the most to gain from Madame Zoraya's death? He glanced back at the broken crystal ball. There, the faint ink smear seemed to speak volumes, hidden clues, carefully placed, all pointing toward something greater. The game had begun. With a final glance at the guests, Poirot straightened his jacket, his expression unreadable. It was time to begin. Chapter 3. The gathering of suspects. The room grew quieter as the guests were herded into the drawing room, their anxious murmurs blending into a hum of discomfort. Each of them had been present at the moment of Madame Zoraya's death, yet none seemed to know how to explain what had happened. Poirot observed them closely, his sharp eyes flicking over each individual as they took their places. Lady Marlowe, still pale and shaken, moved toward the settee, her movements graceful but stiff. Beside her stood her butler, the ever-impassive Mr. Turner, whose expression betrayed no emotion. Despite the tragedy that had occurred under his roof, Poirot's gaze lingered on him for a moment longer than necessary, his mind processing every detail. The slight tension in Turner's shoulders, the rigid way he held his hands behind his back. Poirot shifted his focus to the others. Catherine Durand, a young woman with striking red hair, stood near the window, her gaze fixed on the floor. She had been one of the more vocal guests at the party, and yet now she seemed to shrink away from the attention. Poirot's mind noted the sharp contrast in her demeanor. Where earlier she had been confident and animated, now she appeared uneasy, as though she could no longer maintain the fouet. Ingrid Lindholm, the aristocratic widow, was seated on an armchair, her fingers nervously tapping on the edge of her fan. A woman of notable beauty, Ingrid's presence had commanded attention at dinner. But now her usual composure was failing her. Her eyes darted from one person to another, never settling on any one face. Poirot noted this nervousness was often a mask for something deeper. Dr. Jean-Claude Ekstrom, the family physician, was leaning against the mantelpiece, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He was a tall, lean man with an air of detachment, as if he were watching the scene unfold from a distance rather than being part of it. Poirot observed him for a moment longer, noting the slight narrowing of his eyes whenever he glanced at Madame Zoraya's body. Lastly, there was Charles Duval, a young man with an almost too perfect appearance, dark, neatly combed hair, tailored clothes, and a confident stance. But Poirot's trained eyes saw the tension in his jaw and the flicker of unease in his gaze. Duval had been particularly close to the deceased, having spoken with her several times that evening. Yet now, he seemed to be avoiding eye contact with anyone, as though guilty of some unspoken act. Poirot stood near the door, silent and still, letting the tension grow. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, but he did not allow it to affect him. Instead, he focused on each suspect, processing the subtle signs they were giving away. All of them had been at the scene. All of them had something to hide. Finally, Poirot spoke. "Ms. Amos, we are gathered here because of a tragedy, yes, but also because of something far more complex. The death of Madame Zoraia was no accident. It was not caused by a sudden illness or a stroke of fate. No, it was murder, and it is for me to uncover who amongst you has committed this act." A nervous murmur ran through the group, but Poirot's piercing gaze held them in place. He could already feel the pulse of the room, the way the air had thickened with suspicion. The truth, he knew, lay hidden beneath layers of deception, and it was his job to peel back those layers, one by one. "Now," he continued, "we shall begin with some questions. A simple matter, you might say. But to understand the truth, we must first understand the motives of each of you. I shall start with you, Madame Marlowe." He turned to the hostess, his eyes narrowing as he examined her reaction. "You were the one who invited Madame Zoraia to this gathering, were you not?" Lady Marlowe stiffened at the mention of the fortune-teller's name, her fingers tightening around the lace of her handkerchief. "Yes, I invited her. I thought it would be entertaining," she replied, her voice quivering ever so slightly. Poirot nodded slowly, his mind noting the hesitation in her voice. "Entertaining, indeed. But surely, Madame Marlowe, you must have known that Zoraya's predictions were not always pleasant. Did she not once tell you that your fate would be marked by sorrow?" A cold silence enveloped the room. Lady Marlowe's face tightened at the mention of Zoraya's prophecy. "That was years ago," she murmured, her gaze falling to the floor. Poirot turned his attention to the others, his eyes scanning them one by one. "And you, Mademoiselle Durand, what of you? You seem troubled. Is it the weight of Madame Zoraya's death that affects you so? Or is it something else?" Catherine Durand flinched as though struck, her cheeks flushing slightly. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the others. "I know, I did not expect this," she stammered. "I never thought something like this would happen." Poirot's gaze hardened. "But you were close to Madame Zoraia, were you not? She was your confidant. Did you fear something you have not told us?" Catherine's eyes darted nervously, and she took a step back, her shoulders hunched. Poirot did not press further, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. Poirot's eyes shifted next to Ingrid Lindholm, who had been silent throughout the exchanges. "Madame Lindholm, you have been quiet. Perhaps you are deep in thought, or perhaps you are simply waiting for the right moment to speak." Ingrid's lips parted slightly, but her voice remained calm, betraying no emotion. "I have nothing to hide, Monsieur Poirot. I do not understand how this could have happened. Madame Zoraia was a stranger to me, though I did speak with her briefly this evening. Poirot studied her for a moment, his keen mind taking in the subtleties of her posture and her tone. "Interesting. And what of you, Dr. Ekstrom?" he asked, turning his attention to the physician. "Surely you must have known Madame Zoraya's health. She was a woman of delicate constitution, no?" Ekstrom's lips twitched into a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. "Her health was fine, as far as I knew. I cannot say much more than that." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Of course. And what of you, Monsieur Duval?" He turned to the young man, who had been unusually quiet. "You appear troubled, though you seem eager to avoid the gaze of your fellow guests." Duval's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he remained silent, his posture stiffening at Poirot's words. Poirot took a step back, letting the tension build. "Each of you is hiding something. I can feel it in the air," his voice lowered to a whisper. "But do not worry, Ms. Amos. It will not be long before the truth reveals itself. The game has begun, and I am ready to play." He turned and looked at the shattered crystal ball once more. The game, indeed, had only just begun. Chapter 4. Poirot Arrivas' guests shifted uneasily as Poirot's gaze lingered on them, his presence casting a long shadow over the room. The tension was palpable, like a taut string waiting to snap. Each person was under scrutiny, their every word, gesture, and breath carefully examined by the sharp-eyed detective. They had all been suspects from the very moment the fortune-teller had fallen dead, and now the weight of that suspicion hung heavily in the air. Poirot stood silently for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back, as though savoring the moment before speaking again. He was not one to rush, not one to give away his thoughts too easily. The subtle art of observation was his strength, and he knew that every passing second revealed more about the suspect standing before him. Finally, Poirot broke the silence, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "You see, Ms. Amos, this is not merely about a death. It is about something far more delicate. A thread, if you will, that connects each of you to this tragedy. Each of you has a part to play in this little drama, whether you realize it or not." He paused, letting the words settle. The guests exchanged glances, their faces a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Poirot's eyes never left them as he continued. Madame Zoraia was not simply an entertainer, an illusionist. She was more than that. She was someone who knew things about people, things about their pasts, their fears, their secrets. And secrets, Ms. Amos, are the currency of this world. Lady Marlowe, still sitting with her back stiffly upright, cleared her throat. "Monsieur Poirot, you must understand this is all very distressing. I'm sure there must be some mistake. Madame Zoraia couldn't have known anything about any of us. She was a stranger." Poirot's eyes flicked to Lady Marlowe, his gaze unyielding. "Ah, but that is where you are mistaken, madam. Madame Zoraia's profession was not the only thing that made her dangerous. It was her ability to read people, to perceive the unseen, that gave her the power. You may think she was simply a fortune-teller, but I assure you, she saw much more than anyone realized." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. It was clear that Poirot had struck a nerve. They had all been present when Madame Zoraia had begun to reveal what she saw on their futures, and each of them had been shaken by her words in one way or another. The idea that she might have known something deeper about them, something they would rather not face, was a terrifying thought. Poirot stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room, pausing briefly on each person. His mind was already working, sorting through the complex puzzle in front of him. Each of the suspects had their own reasons for being here, their own motivations. But which one of them had been driven to murder? Turning to Dr. Ekstrom, Poirot inquired, "You, Monsieur Ekstrom, as the family physician, must have known Madame Zoraia's health. Surely you must have recognized the signs of someone in distress? Perhaps you could have prevented this tragedy?" Dr. Ekstrom shifted uncomfortably, his eyes narrowing as he avoided direct eye contact. "I knew Madame Zoraya, of course, but I hardly think her death had anything to do with her health. There was no indication of illness. In fact, she seemed perfectly fine." Poirot nodded slowly, his mind calculating. "Perhaps, but health, physical or mental, is only one aspect. What of her mental state, her emotional well-being? Was there something in her behavior that caught your attention?" Ekstrom's face tightened, and Poirot saw the faintest flicker of hesitation before the doctor replied. "She was eccentric, yes, but that was hardly unusual in her line of work. People in her profession often behave in strange ways." Poirot did not press him further, but his sharp eyes noted the doctor's reluctance to answer. He was hiding something, perhaps something small, perhaps something larger. Either way, Poirot could feel the pulse of a mystery waiting to be uncovered in the subtle words and actions of each person. Next, Poirot turned to Catherine Durand, who had been standing by the window, her hands tightly clasped in front of her. "Mademoiselle Durand, you seem lost in thought. What occupies your mind? Surely you have something to say." Catherine startled, as though caught off guard by his attention. She had been trying to avoid eye contact, but now, faced with Poirot's penetrating gaze, she felt cornered. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice shaky. I didn't know Madame Zoraya well. She was just someone invited by Lady Marlowe. I never imagined anything like this happening." Poirot took a step closer, his eyes studying her. "Is that so? You seem to have a certain discomfort in your eyes, Mademoiselle Durand. You do not seem entirely at ease with the situation." Catherine blushed, a quick flush of color spreading across her cheeks. I'm just shocked. I didn't expect someone to die, especially not in front of so many people." Poirot said nothing, but his mind had already taken note of her discomfort. There was something hidden beneath her words, something she was not telling him. But what was it? Was she hiding guilt? Or was she simply afraid of being implicated in something she did not fully understand? His gaze moved from Catherine to Ingrid Lindholm, who had been quiet throughout the exchange. Poirot noticed the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted her fan. "Madame Lindholm, you have been silent. Surely you have some thoughts to share?" Ingrid's lips parted slightly, but she closed them again, seemingly measuring her words. "I know. I don't have anything to add," she replied curtly, her voice unwavering. Poirot raised an eyebrow. "You are certain? After all, you were present when the tragedy unfolded. You must have some impression of what happened." Ingrid's eyes flickered for the briefest moment, and Poirot caught it. It was a look of caution, one that told him more than words ever could. She was concealing something, but what? Poirot knew one thing for sure: each of these individuals had their own secrets, and one of them had taken advantage of Madame Zoraya's presence to commit murder. But which one? And what had driven them to it? The game, Poirot mused, was far from over. The pieces were in place, but the truth would reveal itself only in time. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The atmosphere in the drawing room had grown heavier with each passing minute. Poirot stood before the guests, his mind turning like the gears of an intricate clock, patiently awaiting the moment to begin. The faces before him were a mixture of unease and defensiveness. They all knew that they were under scrutiny, and yet none of them seemed to fully comprehend the depth of the investigation. "Mon ami, we must begin," Poirot said softly, his gaze sweeping across the group of suspects. "We shall take this step by step, with precision and care. Each of you has a story to tell, and I intend to hear it. What I am interested in, however, is not only what you say, but what you do not say. That, Ms. Amos, will reveal the truth." He turned first to Dr. Ekstrom, the family physician, who was standing near the fireplace, looking slightly more composed than the others. Poirot had already noted the physician's air of detachment, And now, it was time to see if he would continue to hide behind his calm exterior. Dr. Ekstrom, Poirot began, his voice even but probing. You were close to Madame Zoraia, were you not? As a physician, I imagine you must have had some familiarity with her health. Was there anything about her condition that might have given you cause for concern? Dr. Ekstrom hesitated for a moment, as though considering his answer. He took a slow drag from his cigarette, allowing the smoke to curl into the air before speaking. Madame Zoraia was not in ill health, Monsieur Poirot. I had no reason to believe there was anything physically wrong with her. Poirot nodded, but he did not seem entirely convinced. And yet, I wonder, did you not notice anything unusual in her behavior tonight? Surely someone of your profession must have noticed if she was feeling unwell. Dr. Ekstrom's eyes flickered for a moment before he answered, his tone measured. She seemed fine. There was no reason to suspect anything. She was, as you know, a woman of eccentric habits. She could be difficult to read at times. Poirot studied him closely, noting the doctor's reluctance to delve into further detail. Difficult to read, you say? Interesting, Poirot murmured, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. He didn't press further, but his mind was already cataloging this new layer of information. Poirot moved on to Catherine Durand next, whose discomfort was now plainly visible. She had been nervously twisting her hands together. Ever since Poirot had turned his attention toward her, it was time to probe deeper. Mademoiselle Durand, Poirot began, his voice soft yet insistent. You seem troubled, and not just by the death of Madame Zoraia. I sense that there is something more, something you are not telling us. Catherine flinched at the mention of her unease, her eyes darting quickly to the other guests before returning to Poirot. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot, she stammered. I'm just shocked. I can't believe this has happened. Poirot tilted his head, studying her. Ah, but there is more. Nest's pause. You were close to Madame Zoraia, were you not? She told me you were one of the few who truly believed in her abilities. Catherine's eyes widened, and she took a small step back. She told you that I didn't know she spoke of me that way. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. She had a way of making people believe in her. But mademoiselle, it is not just the fortune teller's powers that concern me. It is the motive. What, I wonder, would make a young woman like you so desperate to conceal your emotions? Catherine pressed her lips together tightly, but her eyes gave her away. Poirot could see the unease written all over her face, but she had yet to break. He moved on, sensing that further questioning would yield little more at this time. Turning toward Ingrid Lindholm, Poirot raised an eyebrow. Madame Lindholm, you are silent, as always. What, I wonder, do you have to hide? You do not seem upset by this tragedy. In fact, you appear almost detached. Ingrid's expression remained calm, but Poirot noticed the flicker of something, a slight tightening around her eyes, a brief tightening of her lips. I am upset, Monsieur Poirot, she replied coolly, but I am a woman of experience. I do not give in to hysteria. Death is a part of life. Poirot studied her with a penetrating gaze. A part of life, yes, but it is also a part of something else, a part of motive. Madame Zoraia had the ability to see into the hearts of those around her. Was there something, perhaps, that she saw in you that you wished to remain hidden? Ingrid's eyes narrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. I have nothing to hide, Monsieur Poirot. I hardly knew the woman. She was just a passing guest, as were the rest of us. Poirot wasn't satisfied with her answer, but he moved on. Knowing that time would reveal more about her later, Poirot's gaze then shifted to Charles Duval, who had remained unnervingly quiet throughout the questioning. Duval had been standing with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed as though he were lost in thought. His posture suggested unease, but Poirot knew that he needed to draw him out. Monsieur Duval, Poirot said, his voice cool but firm. You are an interesting case. A young man with a reputation. Tell me, monsieur, did you know Madame Zoraia well? Duval's eyes narrowed as Poirot spoke, but he did not immediately respond. When he did speak, his voice was low and guarded. I knew her, yes. She had a certain charm, but she was unpredictable. People like that can be dangerous. Poirot tilted his head slightly, intrigued. Dangerous? In what way? Duval's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. Poirot pressed on. You were one of the last to speak with her before the incident. What did you discuss? Duval hesitated, his eyes darting toward the others. We spoke about nothing of importance. She wanted to know my future, but I told her it was none of her business. Poirot's gaze sharpened, but he said nothing. He knew that Duval was lying, but he would not press him further just yet. There was a time for confrontation, and it was not yet. For now, the pieces of the puzzle were still shifting into place. With each interview, Poirot was learning more. The guests were uneasy, hiding something in plain sight. But Poirot knew that in time, the truth would be revealed. The game was still in its early stages, but already, the clues were starting to connect. Chapter 6. First false lead. Evening wore on, and as the hours passed, Poirot's quiet observations continued to grow sharper. The guests, though still shaken, had begun to settle into an uneasy rhythm, their nerves still on edge, but their desire to avoid suspicion greater. Yet, in each of their movements, Poirot saw the subtle signs, the smallest tells, the most telling contradictions. The game, as he had already suspected, was more intricate than he had first thought. It was nearing midnight when the constable returned with news that further stirred the already tense atmosphere. Monsieur Poirot, the constable began, his voice filled with urgency. We've found something. I thought it best to bring this to your attention right away. Poirot turned to face him, his expression unreadable, but his mind already preparing for what might be a breakthrough or another diversion. What have you found, my friend? He asked, his voice calm but expectant. The constable held up a small piece of folded paper. This was found in the pocket of Madame Zoraia's gown, near the body. It's a letter, though it was never sealed, just tucked away as if it had been placed there in haste. Poirot's eyes scanned the letter, his fingers delicately unfolding the paper. The handwriting was elegant, but rushed an almost perfect match for the hurried nature of someone with something to hide. He read the contents silently, his brow furrowing slightly. The letter, addressed to an unnamed recipient, read, I have seen too much. The future is as unclear as the past, but what I know now must remain hidden, or else the danger will be far greater than I feared. Tonight will be my last. Poirot's gaze lingered on the words, each one heavy with meaning. He did not speak at first, letting the silence of the room settle like a blanket over the guests. They all watched him intently, waiting for his next move. The air had thickened with the added weight of the discovery. This letter, Mon ami, Poirot began, his voice cutting through the stillness, is both a clue and a red herring. What Madame Zoraia knew, we may never know, but she did leave behind a trail, perhaps one that will mislead us into believing that she was the target of a larger conspiracy. He paused for effect, his eyes scanning the group. But I do not believe it is so simple. This letter speaks of an unknown danger, of a hidden truth that was meant to stay buried. Who, I wonder, is she referring to when she speaks of a greater danger? It seems so theatrical, does it not? A woman who knew the power of words, who spoke of fate and secrets. Was she truly so afraid? Poirot's words left the room in a contemplative silence. The guests, no longer sure of their footing, exchanged uncomfortable glances. The letter had brought more confusion than clarity, a signature trait of Poirot's method. But the detective did not seem at all fazed by the confusion it had caused. If anything, he welcomed it. After all, each piece of the puzzle could be a clue or a trap. Catherine Durand was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling slightly. But How could anyone have known about this letter? It was kept hidden, wasn't it? Poirot turned to her, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Indeed, Mademoiselle Durand. Hidden, yet it was found, and it was placed there by someone who knew exactly where to look, someone who was aware of its existence. The young woman visibly paled, her hand gripping the arm of the chair as though to steady herself. But Poirot wasn't finished. Mon ami, Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping over the group. There is something quite peculiar about this letter. It was written in haste, yet with an unusual clarity. The words speak of a hidden truth, a danger that is unknown. Yet, I suspect, it is the contents of this very letter that mislead us. The idea that Madame's Uriah had uncovered something monumental is tempting. I think it was designed to make us think so. He glanced once more at the paper, then placed it on the table in front of him. There is no doubt this letter is a part of the puzzle, but it is only one piece. We must not allow ourselves to be taken by false leads. Madame Uriah's own words suggest that we are dealing with something far more complex. As Poirot's voice fell quiet, the tension in the room seemed to heighten. The letter had revealed nothing but the suspicion that someone was trying to frame the situation as more than it appeared. For a moment, Poirot seemed lost in thought, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the table. The guests remained silent, unwilling to make a move, afraid of drawing attention. Finally, Poirot's sharp eyes moved back to the group. So, he said, a small smile playing on his lips, now we are left with a conundrum. We know Madame Uriah was frightened. She spoke of danger, but it was not her own demise she was warning against, I think. Someone wanted her death to be perceived as a tragic end to a larger mystery, a mystery that was already in motion. He glanced from one person to the next, his expression calculating. You see, Ms. Amos, the true danger lies not in the letter itself, but in the timing. Who benefited from her death? Who would gain by having this letter discovered at this precise moment? Lady Marlowe's eyes darted nervously. But what does this mean, Monsieur Poirot? How can we possibly know who would benefit? Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. That is the question we will answer, Madame Marlowe. But for now, we must examine this first false lead carefully. This letter is a distraction, a clever ploy. Who gains from it being found? That is where the truth lies. The room fell into deep silence once more, but this time, it was charged with a sense of unease. Poirot had made it clear. The game was afoot, but the first lead was a false one, carefully planted to misdirect them. The true story lay deeper, hidden beneath layers of deception, and Poirot would not rest until it was uncovered. With a final glance at the guests, Poirot spoke softly, almost to himself. We are all but players in a game, Ms. Amos, and now the rules are set. Chapter 7. The psychological gamut tension in the room had escalated with Poirot's words. The letter had caused confusion, yes, but it had also ignited something far more dangerous: suspicion. The guests, once again gathered under the scrutinizing eyes of the detective, stood on the precipice of something they didn't fully understand. Poirot had set the stage, and now the game of subtle mind games was about to begin in earnest. Poirot stood at the head of the room, his posture straight, his expression calm, but his mind was a whirl of thoughts. He knew that the letter was meant to confuse and mislead, but he also understood that every clue, no matter how seemingly inconsequential, was a part of the greater picture. The moment had arrived to begin unraveling the tangled web of human emotions and hidden motivations. Now, Poirot began, his voice soft but firm. We move to the next phase of this investigation. You see, Ms. Amos, the mind is a delicate thing. It is easily swayed by fear, by greed, by guilt. We must look not only at what you say, but at how you say it. We must understand the emotions beneath the surface. The truth, as always, is hidden in plain sight. He paused. letting the weight of his words settle over the group. The air in the room grew thick with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The guests, though none would admit it, were already starting to feel the subtle pressure of Poirot's methods. They had been interviewed, examined, but now they were about to be tested in a way they hadn't yet anticipated. Poirot's eyes flicked to Charles Duval, who had been standing near the window, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Duval had said little in the previous discussions, but Poirot had noted his fidgeting. The way his gaze darted from person to person, always avoiding direct eye contact. This was the moment to press him. "Monsieur Duval," Poirot began, his voice smooth but piercing. "I wonder, have you been honest with me? When I asked you about your connection with Madame Zoraia, you told me there was nothing significant, but I do not believe that is the full story. You were one of the last to speak with her, were you not?" Duval's face paled slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction, his eyes narrowing. "I have nothing more to add, Monsieur Poirot. I've already told you everything. We spoke briefly, and I left it at that." Poirot tilted his head slightly, studying Duval like a chess master watching his opponent's every move. "Is that so? Yet, when I spoke to you earlier, I saw something in your eyes. A flicker, a hesitation. You are not telling me the entire truth, Monsieur Duval." The young man stiffened at the accusation, but Poirot's gaze never wavered. "I do not know what you mean," Duval muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Poirot allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to play on his lips. "Ah, Monsieur Duval, you are attempting to deflect, but it is too late for that. You see, I have learned much from your behavior. It is not what you say that matters, it is how you react when you are confronted with the truth." The guests shifted uneasily as Poirot's words sank in. He turned toward Ingrid Lindholm, his next target. "Madame Lindholm," he began, his voice still calm but with an edge of intensity. "You have remained silent throughout this investigation, and yet I sense something more beneath your quiet exterior. What do you know that you have not shared with us?" Ingrid's eyes flickered at the mention of her name, but she quickly composed herself, her fingers gripping the edge of her fan tightly. "I've told you everything I know, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice steady but tinged with a hint of impatience. "I barely knew Madame Zoraia. Why would I have anything to hide?" Poirot's eyes bored into hers. "Because, Madame Lindholm, I believe you know more than you let on. It is not the obvious lies that concern me, it is the small inconsistencies. The way you avoid certain questions, the way you deflect. These are the signs of someone who is not being entirely forthcoming." Ingrid's jaw tightened, but she did not respond. Poirot moved on, sensing that she would reveal nothing more for now. Instead, he turned his attention to Dr. Ekstrom, who had been standing near the fireplace, staring into the flames. The physician seemed unperturbed by the growing pressure in the room, but Poirot could see the subtle signs of tension in his posture. "Dr. Ekstrom," Poirot said, his voice now taking on a more deliberate tone, "you mentioned that you were familiar with Madame Zoraia's health, but I wonder, did you know of her financial situation? Were there any matters in her personal life that might have caused distress?" Ekstrom did not immediately respond, but Poirot could see him flinch ever so slightly. The physician's eyes flicked to the others, but he quickly looked away. "I did not know her finances, Monsieur Poirot. I was only concerned with her health, nothing more." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his expression one of quiet amusement. "Ah, but you see, Dr. Ekstrom, there's more than just health at stake here. There are emotions, relationships, and financial matters that could have provided motive for someone close to her. You may not have known her finances, but I suspect someone else did." Ekstrom stiffened at the implication, but he remained silent, unwilling to provide Poirot with anything further. Poirot took a step back, observing the group as a whole. The psychological game was in full swing now, and every word, every gesture, was revealing more than they realized. "And now, we come to you, Madame Marlowe," Poirot said, his voice low but carrying an air of finality. "You have been remarkably composed throughout this investigation, but I wonder if you have been hiding something beneath that calm exterior. Perhaps you know more about this affair than you are willing to admit." Lady Marlowe flinched at the directness of Poirot's accusation, but she quickly regained her composure. "I have nothing to hide, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice cool but filled with an undertone of tension. "This tragedy has affected us all, but I have been forthcoming with everything I know." Poirot studied her intently, the smallest of smiles tugging at his lips. "Ah, Madame Marlowe, it is not always what you say that is important, it is what you leave unsaid. And I believe you know more than you have let on." The silence that followed was thick with tension. The game was no longer about the letter or the shattered crystal ball. It was about the minds of the people in the room. Poirot had begun to lay his traps, testing each one, watching them react. The psychological game was well underway, and Poirot was certain that one of these individuals would slip, revealing the truth hidden beneath their defenses, and when they did, Poirot would be ready. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery room was thick with tension as Poirot's observations echoed in. The minds of the guests, the subtle psychological traps he had set earlier, had done their work. Each of them, whether they realized it or not, had been left slightly off balance, their defensiveness growing with each passing question. Yet, Poirot knew that the game was far from over. He had only begun to scratch the surface, and there was much more to uncover. It was then, as the group lingered in the drawing room, that the unexpected happened. A sudden scream cut through the stillness, sharp and piercing, reverberating off the walls. It was enough to send everyone into a flurry of motion, but it was Lady Marlowe's maid Ellen, who rushed into the room, her face ashen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Monsieur Poirot," Ellen cried out, her voice trembling, "you must come quickly. There's been another incident." Poirot's eyes locked onto hers, his expression still, but his mind instantly calculating. Another incident? What could this possibly mean? Without waiting for another word, Poirot turned to the others. "Please remain here," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I will return shortly. This is no time for further questions. This new development may answer many things." With that, Poirot followed the maid swiftly out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hall. The rest of the guests remained in place, glancing nervously at one another, unsure of what had just transpired. A secondary mystery had presented itself, and Poirot's instincts told him that it was linked to the greater puzzle at hand. Ellen led him down the hallway and into the estate's smaller library, where an alarming scene greeted him. A small table had been upturned, books scattered across the floor, and in the center of the room, a small, delicate vial lay shattered. A faint smell of almonds filled the air. Poirot knelt down beside the remains of the vial, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The substance inside had clearly been some sort of poison, though not one he recognized immediately. His fingers hovered above the remnants of the vial, careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. "Do you know who found this?" Poirot asked, glancing up at Ellen, who stood by the door, wringing her hands. "I did, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice still shaky. "I was cleaning the library when I saw it. The vial, it was there in the corner where no one had been. I swear it wasn't here before." Poirot's mind raced as he considered the implications of this new revelation. Someone had been trying to poison another, possibly someone among the guests, or perhaps even Lady Marlowe herself. The vial was certainly small, not large enough to kill multiple people, but enough to harm one. But who had been the intended victim? "Mademoiselle," Poirot said, standing and turning to Ellen, "was anyone in this room recently, before you found this?" Ellen shook her head. "I don't know. No one was here, I swear. But when I came in, I saw Madame Zoraya's chair had been moved, and there were strange marks on the carpet, like someone had dragged something. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he processed this new detail. Madame Zoraya's chair had been moved. Was it possible that the fortune teller had come into the library before her death? Or was someone trying to plant a false lead? Poirot couldn't be sure yet. But one thing was certain. Someone had intended for this poison to be used. "I will need to examine this vial further," Poirot said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "But for now, we must return to the others." As he left the room, Poirot's thoughts began to organize themselves. This new mystery, the poison, the strange marks on the carpetol of it pointed to someone trying to remove traces of an earlier crime. Someone wanted to cover their tracks, but the question was, why? What had they been attempting to hide, and how did it tie into Madame Zoraya's death? Returning to the drawing room, Poirot saw the faces of the guests filled with worry and confusion. Lady Marlowe had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice trembling, "what is happening? What did you find?" Poirot wasted no time in addressing the group. He stood at the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the guests before settling on Lady Marlowe. "Madam," he began, his voice calm but firm, "we have a new development. A vial of poison was found in the library, and though the intended victim remains unclear, I suspect it was meant for someone in this very room." Gasps filled the space as the guests exchanged panicked glances. "Poison," Catherine Durand said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you saying someone tried to kill one of us?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Yes, and it appears someone tried to cover their tracks, but they did not succeed. The poison was carefully placed, but it was discovered in time." "And you think this is connected to Madame Zoraya's death?" Ingrid Lindholm asked, her eyes flashing with a mix of fear and suspicion. Poirot's eyes darkened, and he gave a slight nod. "Indeed, I believe the two are connected. The poison, the vial, the subtle attempt to erase any evidence someone is attempting to divert us from the truth." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Poirot knew that this was no random act of malice. Someone had calculated this, planned it meticulously. The question, of course, was who and why. Poirot's gaze shifted once again over the guests, his mind already drawing connections between the small details he had gathered. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the final image was still unclear. "This is no longer a simple matter of one death," Poirot said, his voice low but filled with authority. "This is a carefully orchestrated series of events, and I will find the person who is behind it all." The guests exchanged nervous glances once more, but Poirot's determination was unshakable. He could feel the truth inching closer, and soon it would all be laid bare. The psychological game had just taken a darker turn. Chapter 9. Hidden connections. The guests in the drawing room had fallen silent, their eyes fixed on Poirot, waiting for him to reveal the next step in his investigation. The shock of the newly discovered poison was still fresh, and the tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. Poirot stood before them, his mind already working through the new puzzle that had presented itself, each piece slowly falling into place. What has been revealed to us, Ms. Amos, is only a small part of the greater story, Poirot began, his voice steady but filled with a quiet urgency. The poison in the library, the strange markings on the carpet, the letter found in Madame Zoraya's possession, all of these are linked. But how? We must look deeper, examine the connections that bind these events together. There are relationships between each of you that we have not yet explored, and it is those relationships that will lead us to the truth. Lady Marlowe's eyes narrowed slightly, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair. "You're suggesting that one of us is involved?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and rising tension. Poirot nodded, his gaze sweeping over the group. Exactly, madam. One of you is not only connected to the events surrounding Madame Zoraya's death, but is actively involved in a conspiracy. Someone here has hidden their true motives, but it is only a matter of time before those motives surface. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. The guests looked uneasy, some shifting in their seats, others exchanging uncertain glances. Poirot could see the unease in their eyes, but it was clear that none of them had the courage or the knowledge to reveal the truth. Poirot turned his attention to the letter once more. It lay on the table in front of him, the ink smudged slightly. The paper creased from where it had been hastily folded and tucked away. This letter, Poirot continued, was not written by chance. It was a calculated move. Madame Zoraia wrote it with one purpose: to create confusion, to direct our attention elsewhere. But it was not meant to be found by accident. No, it was placed there for a reason. His eyes flicked to the guests once more. And that reason, Ms. Amos, is this: someone in this room knew exactly where to look. Someone knew that the letter would divert suspicion. Someone wanted us to think that Madame Zoraia was merely a victim of her own foretelling, that she had been afraid of something she saw in her crystal ball. But I do not believe it was her fear that led to her death. The room was deathly quiet as Poirot's words hung in the air, their implications sinking in slowly. The guests, now more than ever, seemed on edge, their every movement scrutinized by Poirot's penetrating gaze. Poirot's mind raced through the possibilities. The letter, the poison, the broken crystal ball, each of these was a part of a larger picture, a picture he had yet to fully decipher. But there was one thing he knew for certain: someone here had a hidden connection to Madame Zoraia. Someone had known too much, or perhaps had too much to lose. It was then that Poirot's eyes landed on Dr. Ekstrom, who had been unusually quiet since the discovery of the poison. The doctor's face was impassive, but Poirot noted the slight twitch in his hand as he adjusted his glasses, a subtle giveaway. "Monsieur Ekstrom," Poirot began, his voice quiet but firm, "you are a man of science, are you not? A man who deals in facts and evidence. And yet, your demeanor suggests that you are hiding something. I wonder what role did you play in all of this?" Dr. Ekstrom stiffened, but Poirot could see the brief flicker of guilt in his eyes. "I told you everything I know," he said, his voice betraying just the slightest edge of frustration. "I had no involvement with Madame Zoraya's death, nor do I know anything about this poison." Poirot didn't respond immediately, but his mind raced as he analyzed Dr. Ekstrom's words. There was something about the doctor that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't the way he spoke, no. It was the way he moved, the way he avoided direct eye contact when faced with a direct question. Poirot had seen this type of behavior before in criminals. Those who knew more than they were letting on. Those who tried to deflect suspicion, without realizing that their actions only made them more suspicious. "Dr. Ekstrom," Poirot said, his tone shifting slightly, "I do not believe you. You have been hiding something from us. I have already noticed the small inconsistencies in your answers. But now, I think I understand. You were the one who encouraged Madame Zoraia to look deeper, to see things she should not have seen. But you did not want her to expose the truth, did you?" Dr. Ekstrom's face went pale, and for a brief moment, Poirot saw a flash of panic in his eyes. The doctor quickly regained his composure, but the damage had been done. Poirot knew he had struck a nerve. "Monsieur Poirot, you are mistaken," Ekstrom said quickly. But his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier. "I had no part in this. I did not know about the poison, and I certainly did not instruct Madame Zoraia to do anything." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Then explain, monsieur, why you were the one who knew where to find the vial of poison. It was hidden, yes, but you knew where it was, and you knew exactly what it could do. That is no coincidence. You knew more about Madame Zoraia than you have let on." For a moment, Dr. Ekstrom said nothing. The silence in the room was deafening, and Poirot could feel the tension rise once again. The doctor's mask was slipping, revealing a glimpse of the truth behind it. I did not want to hurt anyone," Ekstrom murmured, his voice barely audible. "But I was afraid. Madame Zoraya had learned things about me, about my past. She was going to expose me. I couldn't let her." Poirot's eyes widened ever so slightly. This was the connection he had been searching for. Dr. Ekstrom had a motive, and it was one rooted in fear. The doctor had feared that Madame Zoraya would expose something far darker than anyone had realized, and that fear had driven him to murder. Poirot turned to the others, his voice steady but filled with certainty. "Mzamis, we have uncovered a key piece of the puzzle, but there is more to this story than just Dr. Ekstrom's fear. The true nature of Madame Zoraya's death is now clear. We must continue, for the game is far from over." The room was filled with a sense of unease. The guests, now fully aware that Poirot was on the trail of something much more sinister than they had imagined. The connections were becoming clearer, but the final reveal was still far out of reach. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. Poirot stood silently in the center of the drawing room, his sharp eyes flicking from one guest to another. The revelation about Dr. Ekstrom had shaken the group, but Poirot was not yet satisfied. There were still so many threads to pull, so many hidden truths to expose. The guests, though unsettled by the doctor's confession, had not yet realized that Poirot was far from done. He had learned a great deal, but there was one key detail, one inconsistency that had yet to be addressed. Poirot had always been a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts told him that something was missing, something that didn't quite add up. The poison, the letter, the strange behavior of the guests, these were all pieces of a larger puzzle. But one piece was still elusive, just out of reach. He had been waiting for the right moment to reveal it, and now that moment had come. "Monsieur Ekstrom," Poirot began, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of tension. "You have confessed to your fear of Madame Zoraya, but you have not yet told us the whole truth. Why did you feel the need to silence her, to go so far as to murder her?" The doctor stiffened, his eyes darting nervously to the other guests. He had not expected Poirot to press him so directly. "I already told you I was afraid she would expose me," he said, his voice strained. "She was a fortune teller, and she knew things that were too dangerous for anyone to know." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving Ekstrom's face. "And yet, Dr. Ekstrom, you have failed to mention something very important, something that I noticed earlier today but have not yet addressed. It is the small detail that you did not think to hide the ink stain on the crystal ball." The room went silent, the guests staring at Poirot in confusion. Ekstrom's face went pale, and for the first time, he appeared genuinely rattled. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Poirot continued, his voice steady but laced with authority. "You see, mon ami, there is something that cannot be overlooked. The crystal ball, broken though it maybe, was not just shattered by accident. No, there is a clue hidden in the way it broke. The ink stain on the glass, though seemingly inconspicuous, is the key. It was placed there deliberately." Poirot's eyes flicked to the guests, each of them now staring at him in rapt attention. "I have no doubt that the ink was spilled by you, Dr. Ekstrom. The question is, why?" The doctor's hands shook slightly as he clenched them into fists. "I don't know what you mean," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I never touched the crystal ball. I had nothing to do with it." Poirot smiled softly, a smile that held no warmth. "Ah, but you did, mon ami. You see, I have been studying the ball ever since I entered this room, and there is one detail that tells me everything I need to know. The ink on the glass was not spilled by accident. It was placed there intentionally. Someone was trying to leave a mark, a signature of sorts, something to guide us in the right direction." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, each one processing the implications of Poirot's words. Ekstrom, now visibly sweating, took a step back, his mind racing to find a way out of this situation. "You're wrong," Ekstrom said, his voice trembling. "I didn't." Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. "No, Dr. Ekstrom, you did. You were the one who handled that crystal ball, who left the ink stain. But I am not here to accuse you of trivialities. I am here to uncover the truth." Poirot turned toward the others, his gaze hardening. "What you fail to realize, Mzamas, is that the true purpose of the crystal ball was never to foretell the future. No, it was a tool to manipulate you all. Madame Zoraya had a gift, but it was not what she claimed. She knew how to play on your fears, your desires, your weaknesses. She used the ball to extract information from you, to gain control over your lives." Lady Marlowe's eyes widened, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "But she never." Poirot cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Oh, but she did, madam. She planted ideas in your minds, fed you false truths, all the while using the crystal ball to create a facade of control. And you, each of you, believed in her power. But in the end, it was all a lie." The room was now filled with murmurs of disbelief. Some of the guests appeared uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others exchanged furtive glances. Poirot could feel the pressure building, but he wasn't finished yet. The letter, the poison, the broken crystal ball, all of these things are part of a much larger game. "But there is one thing that I have not yet revealed," Poirot continued, his voice growing quieter. "The ink on the glass was not placed by Dr. Ekstrom alone. No, Mzamas, he had help." The guests froze, and Poirot could see their minds racing, trying to piece together the new revelation. Ekstrom's hands trembled, and his eyes darted toward the door as if considering an escape. But Poirot was quicker. He turned to Catherine Durand, who had been quiet for much of the conversation, her face pale and drawn. "Mademoiselle Durand," Poirot said, his tone soft but cutting, "you have been silent through much of this, but your silence speaks volumes. You were in the library when the poison was discovered, were you not? You were near Madame Zoraya when the crystal ball was shattered. And I suspect that you were the one who helped Dr. Ekstrom plant the ink stain." Catherine's face drained of color, and she opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Poirot continued, his gaze unwavering. "You see, Mademoiselle Durand, you were not just an innocent bystander in this affair. You were an accomplice. The question now is, why?" The room was thick with anticipation as Poirot's words hung in the air. He had discovered the hidden connection between the guests, one that was more dangerous than he had imagined. The psychological game was far from over, and the final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. The truth was close, but it would require one final push to uncover. Poirot was ready. Chapter 11. Tensions risen. The room grew deathly silent as Poirot's accusation hung in the air, his eyes fixed intently on Catherine Durand. Her face was a mask of shock, but Poirot could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. She was trying to maintain control, but it was clear that she had been caught off guard. "Mademoiselle Durand," Poirot said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You are trembling. You have been caught in a lie, and now you must explain yourself. You were in the library when the poison was discovered. You were close to Madame Zoraya when the crystal ball was shattered. And yet, you say nothing. Why?" Catherine opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was visibly shaken, her eyes darting toward the other guests, as though searching for some form of support. But none came. They were all too consumed with their own fears, their own suspicions, to offer her any help. Poirot continued, his gaze unyielding. "You and Dr. Ekstrom had a plan, did you not? You helped him to plant the ink stain on the crystal ball, hoping to mislead us. You knew it would be found, and you hoped that it would point us in the wrong direction. But it didn't, did it?" Catherine's shoulders sagged as she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I didn't. I didn't want anyone to die." Poirot's expression softened, but only slightly. "Then why, Mademoiselle Durand, did you participate in such a plan? Why deceive us all if you truly had no ill intentions?" She paused, struggling to find the right words. "I was afraid. Madame Zoraya knew things about me, things I didn't want anyone to know. She was going to expose me. I thought if I helped Dr. Ekstrom, if we could stop her, everything would be fine." Poirot's brow furrowed slightly, his mind processing the information. "You feared Madame Zoraya's knowledge of your past, and yet you chose to go to such extremes to silence her. You knew she was dangerous, but you underestimated her ability to manipulate those around her. She was playing a game, and you were merely one of her pawns." Catherine nodded, her head hanging low in shame. "I should have known better, but at the moment, I just wanted to protect myself." Poirot glanced at the others in the room, each of them watching Catherine with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The truth was beginning to surface, and the tension was palpable. But Poirot wasn't finished. "Dr. Ekstrom," Poirot said, turning his gaze to the doctor, "you are not without guilt in this matter either. You sought to protect yourself, yes, but you also knew that Madame Zoraya was a threat to your secret. You used Catherine as your accomplice, but you both underestimated the power of your actions." Ekstrom's face darkened, and he took a step back, his jaw clenched. I didn't want any of this. You have no idea what it's like to have your past come back to haunt you," he muttered, his voice low and strained. Poirot's eyes remained fixed on him. "Perhaps, Dr. Ekstrom, but your past does not justify murder. The poison, the lies, the deceit, it all points to a greater truth. You and Mademoiselle Durand thought you could control the situation, but in doing so, you sealed your own fate." Catherine's head snapped up at Poirot's words, her eyes wide with terror. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean by sealed our fate?" Poirot's expression grew colder, his voice steady as he spoke. "I mean that your actions have set in motion a series of events that cannot be undone. The truth is closing in on you, Ms. Amos. You may have believed that you could hide your sins, but you were wrong." There was a moment of tense silence before Poirot added, "And now, we must see this through to the end. The game is nearing its conclusion, and soon, the truth will be revealed." As Poirot turned toward the rest of the room, the weight of his words hung in the air, leaving a sense of foreboding that none of the guests could ignore. The walls had closed in, and there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. Catherine, still trembling, looked toward the others, but no one spoke. The room was thick with suspicion, and Poirot knew that his next move would be the final one. Chapter 12. The confrontation there in the drawing room had thickened, the weight of Poirot's words hanging over the guests like a storm about to break. Each person in the room was now fully aware of the detective's sharp eye and his ability to uncover the smallest inconsistencies. The guests, once so confident in their innocence, were now standing on shifting ground. The tension in the room was palpable, and no one dared to speak. Poirot's gaze swept over each of them: Lady Marlowe, Dr. Ekstrom, Ingrid Lindholm, Catherine Durand, and Charles Duval. They were all connected, in some way, to the mystery of Madame Zoraya's death. But there was still one last puzzle to solve, one final piece to fit into place. The room was quiet, save for the soft tick of a clock on the mantelpiece, marking the passage of time. Poirot, ever composed, broke the silence with a single word. "It is time." The guests stirred, but no one spoke. Poirot's voice, calm yet filled with the promise of impending revelation, carried through the room. "You have all been part of this mystery, whether you were aware of it or not. But now, I believe we are ready to uncover the truth. No more deception, no more misdirection. I have pieced together enough of your stories to understand the shape of the crime." Lady Marlowe, her composure beginning to crack, looked at Poirot with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "What are you saying, Monsieur Poirot? What do you know?" Poirot turned his gaze to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What I know, madam, is that this has never been about a simple death. Madame Zoraia was no innocent victim. She was a woman who knew too much. But more than that, she was a woman who had power over those who sought to protect their secrets." The guests exchanged uneasy glances. Catherine Durand, still trembling, stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "But why? Why would any of us want to harm her?" Poirot's eyes shifted to her. "Why, indeed, Mademoiselle Durand. But you see, it is not a matter of why, it is a matter of who. Who among you was afraid of Madame Zoraia's knowledge? Who was willing to silence her, even if it meant murder?" His eyes moved from Catherine to Dr. Ekstrom and then to Ingrid Lindholm. "You all had your reasons, your motives. Fear, greed, guilt, they clouded your judgment, led you to make decisions that ultimately brought about this tragedy. But the question remains, who was the one who struck the final blow?" There was a brief, tense silence before Poirot continued. "It was not just Dr. Ekstrom who sought to protect his secrets. It was not just Mademoiselle Durand who feared being exposed. No, Ms. Amos, it was one of you who knew exactly how to play the game. One of you who orchestrated this entire affair, manipulating the rest of you like pieces on a chessboard." The group shifted, the weight of Poirot's words settling in. It was clear now there was someone in the room who had orchestrated not just Madame Zoraia's death, but the chaos that had followed. Someone who had known exactly how to direct attention away from themselves. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he turned to the final person in the room. Charles Duval. His posture had been stiff throughout the investigation, and his nervousness was becoming increasingly evident. Poirot's suspicions had grown over the course of their time together, but now they had reached a conclusion. "Ah, Monsieur Duval," Poirot said, his voice filled with a mixture of authority and finality. "You, of all people, have been the most elusive. You, who have been hiding in plain sight. It is you who has been pulling the strings, isn't it?" Duval's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, he seemed to lose his composure. He stumbled backward, his hands gripping the back of a chair as though to steady himself. "I don't know what you mean," he stammered. Poirot's eyes never wavered. "Oh, but you do. You have been playing a dangerous game, Monsieur Duval. You knew that Madame Zoraia was onto something that could ruin you. You were afraid that she would expose the truth, and so you decided to act. You orchestrated the poisoning, you manipulated the others, and you thought you could get away with it." Duval's face contorted with a mixture of anger and fear. "You're wrong. I didn't." Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. "No more lies, Monsieur Duval. I have seen through your facade. The letter, the poison, the broken crystal ball, they were all part of your plan. You used Madame Zoraia's power against her, turning it into a weapon. But in the end, you miscalculated. You underestimated the power of the truth. The room was still." The guests now fully aware of the gravity of Poirot's words. Duval stood frozen, his face pale as he realized the detective had uncovered his carefully laid plans. Poirot stepped forward, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "The game is over, Monsieur Duval. You may have thought you could hide your secrets, but the truth always comes to light, one way or another." Duval opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. His shoulders slumped, and it was clear to all present that Poirot had won. The final piece of the puzzle had been placed, and the truth had been revealed. Poirot stood in the center of the room, his expression calm but resolute. The mystery is solved, and justice will be served. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. Heath's silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating. Poirot's revelation had sent a tremor through the group, and now, with Duval standing at the center, frozen in shock and defeat, The weight of the truth hung heavily in the air. The detective's eyes, cold and calculating, were fixed on Duval, watching for the faintest sign of reaction. The truth had come to light, but Poirot knew that the resolution was not as simple as the confession of one man. There was still something more to be done. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece, marking time as if it, too, were waiting for the next move. Duval, his face pale and his jaw clenched, seemed to be trapped in his own thoughts. His gaze flickered toward the door, and for just an instant, Poirot saw the faintest glint of something darker in his eyes. Without warning, Duval made a sudden move. He lunged toward the door, his hand gripping the handle with desperation. The sound of the door rattling as he tried to open it broke the silence like a gunshot. But before he could escape, Poirot was already there, his quick reflexes closing the gap between them. "Ah, Monsieur Duval," Poirot said, his voice sharp as a whip. "You think you can simply walk away? That the consequences of your actions can be avoided by fleeing?" Duval's hand trembled on the door handle, his breathing shallow. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice ragged. "I didn't want it to go this far. I thought I could control it. But now," Poirot's eyes hardened as he stepped closer, his expression unwavering. "You do not control the truth, Monsieur Duval. You thought you could manipulate others, twist the circumstances to your favor. But in the end, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. No one can escape it." Duval turned to face him, his expression a mix of fear and defiance. "I had no choice," he snapped. "Zoraia, she knew too much. She would have ruined everything. I couldn't let her." Poirot's eyes flashed with understanding, but his tone remained calm. "Ah, I see. You believed you could silence her and protect your secret. But you underestimated Madame Zoraia's power. She was more than a mere fortune teller, wasn't she? She was a force that could disrupt your carefully constructed life, and you feared that more than anything." Duval's shoulders slumped as the weight of his own guilt settled upon him. The desperate attempt to flee was nothing more than a futile last effort, a man trying to outrun the consequences of his actions. But it was too late. The trap had been sprung, and the truth could no longer be avoided. "Stop, Duval," Poirot said, his voice softening just slightly, though it remained firm. "It is over. You cannot outrun what you have done. The game is finished." Duval's eyes flashed with panic as he backed away from the door, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "I didn't mean to kill her, you know. I only wanted to stop her from talking, from exposing the truth. I thought if I could make her disappear." Poirot's voice interrupted him, cold and cutting. "It was not just her death you were concerned with. It was the truth that threatened to unravel everything. You killed Madame Zoraia to protect your own secret, your own reputation. But you failed, Monsieur Duval, and now you must face the consequences." Duval's face twisted with a mixture of anger and despair, and for a moment it seemed as though he might make another move, perhaps to run, perhaps to lash out. But Poirot's presence was unyielding, his calm demeanor unshakable. There would be no escaping this moment, no evading the truth. "Why don't you just let me go?" Duval begged, his voice cracking. "You have everything now. What more do you want?" Poirot's expression softened, but only slightly. "Justice, Monsieur Duval. That is all I seek. You have taken a life, and now you must answer for it. But it is not only the death of Madame Zoraia that matters. It is the lives you have destroyed in the process, the trust you have shattered, the lies you have spun. That is the true cost of your actions." Duval's shoulders slumped in defeat, and he took a step back, his head hanging low. The fight had drained out of him. Poirot had won, and there was no longer any room for denial or resistance. "Take him," Poirot said, his voice soft but firm, signaling to the constable who had been waiting outside. The constable moved forward, his face grim but resolute. as the constable placed a hand on Duval's shoulder and led him away. Poirot took a moment to reflect. The resolution of the case was not as satisfying as he had hoped. It was not a grand reveal or a dramatic confrontation. It was simply the quiet culmination of a long, careful investigation. Duval had been the architect of his own downfall, and now he would face the consequences of his choices. Poirot turned back to the guests, his eyes sweeping over them once more. The storm had passed, but the calm that followed was not one of peace. It was the calm of a man who had seen the depths of human deceit and understood the true nature of those around him. Justice has been served, Poirot said, his voice steady but filled with finality. And now, Ms. Amos, the case is closed. The room remained still as the weight of his words settled over them. The mystery had been unraveled, and the truth had been revealed. The game, at long last, was over. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into Placide's room was still. The case, it seemed, was done. Yet, Poirot knew better than to think the story had reached its final chapter without lingering doubts. Though Duval had been apprehended, his confession of sorts still left many gaps in the tale. The others in the room, though spared from the criminal's hand, were left with their own unspoken stories of lies, secrets, and motives. Poirot, for all his composure, remained deep in thought. He had seen it all unfold, each piece carefully connected. But it wasn't enough to just have Duval's confession. No, he needed the whole picture, the complete picture, with every detail of the narrative lined up perfectly. There was something lingering on the edges of his mind that he could not yet fully grasp. Lady Marlowe, who had been silent throughout the final confrontation, was the first to speak, though her voice quivered with a mixture of relief and fear. "Monsieur Poirot, you've solved it. Duval, he was the murderer. You've caught him. But what of the rest of us? What do you think of us now?" Poirot's eyes softened as he turned to the hostess, his expression unreadable. "Madam, you are not responsible for Duval's actions, but you, like the others, have played a role in the events that led us here. Each of you had something to gain or lose from Madame Zoraya's revelations. It is not just the murderer who must face the consequences of their choices, but each person who allowed the deceit to grow unchecked." Lady Marlowe looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "We all knew Madame Zoraya's ability, her so-called power, but we didn't want any harm to come of it." Poirot nodded. "Exactly, Madame Marlowe. None of you intended harm, yet you allowed her influence to linger, feeding off the fear and insecurities you carried. Even if you didn't act directly, you still allowed the situation to evolve. You did not stop it." He turned his gaze to the others, Catherine Durand, Ingrid Lindholm, and Dr. Ekstrom, each of whom had faced his scrutiny and answered his questions in their own ways. "You all had your reasons, your fears, your desires, but in the end, those reasons led us here, to this room, where a life was taken and another nearly lost." Dr. Ekstrom shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Ingrid's fingers gripped her fan tightly, but she, too, remained silent. Poirot's eyes narrowed, sensing that there was more to uncover. Even if Duval had confessed, Poirot turned back to the table, where the shattered crystal ball and the poisoned vial still lay, forgotten but not irrelevant. They were symbols of how each of them had danced around the truth, never fully confronting what lay beneath the surface. The letter, the ink stain, the poison, all of these were distractions, carefully crafted to pull attention away from the real issue: fear. Fear of exposure, fear of control, fear of what others might uncover. "The truth," Poirot said, his voice gaining a touch of gravity, "is never as simple as the crime itself. The crime is the culmination of something much deeper. It is a reflection of what lies hidden inside each person, what they are willing to do to protect themselves, to protect their secrets." The room remained quiet as Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He turned to each of the guests, his eyes lingering on them for a moment longer than necessary. The truth had already been revealed: Duval's guilt, his desperation, his need to control and hide. But it was the others who had allowed it all to happen, without their fears, without their willingness to allow Madame Zoraia to play her game. The tragedy might never have unfolded. Poirot exhaled softly, a look of finality settling over his face. "You are all guilty," he continued, "but not in the way Duval is. You are guilty of complicity, of failing to confront the truth before it spiraled out of control. Each of you allowed this to happen, and now you must live with that knowledge." The silence that followed was deep, the guests absorbing the weight of Poirot's words. None of them spoke, for they understood what he meant. They had all been complicit, each in their own way. Poirot finally looked at them one last time, his face softening, just a little. "But there is one thing to remember, Mzamas. You have been given a second chance. A chance to understand the consequences of your actions and the power of the truth. Let that be your lesson." He turned then, moving toward the door, his steps purposeful and sure. He had solved the case. But the deeper work, the work of self-reflection, was something only the guests could do for themselves. As Poirot left the room, the guests remained seated, each of them grappling with the realization that the detective had left them with more than just a solution to a crime. He had left them with a mirror, one that would force them to look into the depths of their own souls and confront the truths they had been avoiding. The case was over, but its repercussions would continue to echo in the minds of those who had been caught in the web of deception. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. Heavy silence lingered long after Poirot had exited the room, leaving the guests to sit in the wake of his revelations. They were still processing his words, each one of them grappling with the weight of what had been uncovered: Duval's guilt, their own complicity, and the inescapable truth that the detective had laid bare. It was as if the room itself had absorbed the tension, now pulsing with the remnants of a game that had come to an end. No one moved, no one spoke. Lady Marlowe, her face pale and drained, was the first to break the silence. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her once commanding presence had vanished, replaced by a vulnerability that had been absent since the start of the evening. Dr. Ekstrom, his face a mask of resignation, leaned back in his chair. "I suppose we will wait for the authorities to arrive. Poirot has done his part. We have no control over what happens next." Catherine Durand shifted uneasily in her seat, still trembling. "But what happens to us now? To our lives? How can we go on after all this?" Poirot had exposed everything, every hidden fear, every buried truth. Now, the room felt like a stage set for some kind of reckoning, as if they were all waiting for some final judgment. Ingrid Lindholm, who had been unnervingly quiet, let out a long sigh. "We've all been dragged into this mess. Each of us has been caught in Poirot's web, and now there's no going back. The damage has been done, whether we like it or not." Poirot's absence was the loudest presence in the room. His piercing insights had unraveled the facade they had all carefully crafted, and now, with Duval's fate sealed, it was as if the truth had stripped them bare. Each of them had been forced to face their own darkness, and in doing so, they were left with only the wreckage of their actions. It was Lady Marlowe who spoke again, her voice trembling but firm. "Do you think Poirot truly understands us? Do you think he's right in what he said about us?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered for a long moment. Finally, Dr. Ekstrom spoke, his voice thick with guilt. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I've never been good at understanding people. I've always relied on science, on what can be measured, what can be known. But this is different. Poirot doesn't just solve crimes. He solves people. He sees us for what we really are. And what are we?" Catherine asked, her voice barely audible. Dr. Ekstrom didn't respond immediately. His eyes met hers, and for the first time that evening, he appeared to be grappling with something deeper than his own self-preservation. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I suppose we are just as flawed as he says." The conversation stilled once more as each person reflected on the truth they had just faced. The air was thick with unspoken realizations, and yet none of them seemed willing to confront what was happening inside themselves. The secrets had been exposed, but now they were left with the aftermath, the wreckage of their own lives, shattered in the wake of a single murder, after what seemed like an eternity. Poirot re-entered the room, his face as calm and composed as ever. He walked toward the center of the room, where the broken crystal ball and scattered poison vials still lay. The pieces of the puzzle had been assembled, and now, with the conclusion in sight, Poirot's presence was like the closing of a chapter. "I have spoken with the authorities," Poirot said, his voice measured, his eyes scanning each guest in turn. "Monsieur Duval will be taken into custody, and the necessary arrangements will be made. But as for the rest of you, you must now live with what you have done, and with what you have allowed to happen." Lady Marlowe looked at him, her eyes wide with the weight of her own regret. "And what of us, Poirot? Do you think we are as guilty as Duval?" Poirot took a moment to answer, his gaze lingering on the broken remnants of the crystal ball. "Guilt is a complicated thing, madam. Some of you are guilty of a crime of omission, others of commission. But in the end, what matters is not what I think, but what you think. You must decide for yourselves whether you can live with what has been done." The guests shifted uncomfortably, their faces flushed with a mixture of shame and resignation. Poirot's words hung in the air like an unspoken sentence, each person now left to face the consequences of their actions in the quiet aftermath. Poirot turned and made his way to the door. "The game is over," he said simply, without turning around. "The truth has been revealed. Now you must live with it." As he left the room, the guests were left in the heavy silence of their own thoughts. There was no more mystery to solve, no more lies to uncover. Only the painful reality of what they had allowed to unfold. The game was over, and they were left to reckon with the truth. Chapter 16. The reveal there in the room seemed to grow heavier. As Poirot's words settled into the hearts of those left behind in the drawing room, there was a lingering sense of finality. A quiet understanding that what had begun as an evening of uncertainty had now come to an irreversible conclusion. The guilt, the fear, the secrets, everything had been exposed. As Poirot closed the door softly behind him, the silence was deafening. The guests remained motionless, their eyes vacant, each lost in the labyrinth of their own thoughts. Duval's fate was sealed, and the authorities would take over from here. But for the others, a deeper reckoning remained, one that only they could face. Lady Marlowe, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, was the first to break the silence. "Is it really over, Poirot?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mix of dread and something else, relief perhaps, or perhaps fear of what would follow. Poirot's gaze met hers, his eyes never wavering. "The truth has been revealed, madam. There is no more mystery to solve. But the consequences, they will remain." A long pause followed, as Lady Marlowe absorbed his words. It was as though the weight of her own role in the unfolding events had finally settled upon her shoulders. She had known something all along, had been a part of it, and yet the consequences of her actions had remained obscured, hidden beneath the fog of denial. "I did not intend for any of this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what it would cost. How could I have known?" Poirot's eyes softened for a moment. "We all have our blind spots, Madame Marlowe, and we all must pay the price for the choices we make." The room seemed to grow even colder as the guests, each of them racked with their own guilt, looked to Poirot for some final judgment. But he was not there to pass sentence. He was there only to reveal the truth, and the truth, as always, was harsh and unforgiving. Catherine Durand, her face pale and drawn, spoke next, her voice a low, almost haunted whisper. "What happens now, Poirot? Will Duval be punished? Will we be left to go on with our lives?" Poirot looked at her for a long moment, his gaze piercing yet calm. "Justice, Mademoiselle Durand, will follow its course. As for the rest of you, that is something you must decide for yourselves. You have been complicit in the actions that led to Madame Zoraya's death, and now you must live with the knowledge of what you have allowed to happen." Catherine's breath caught in her throat as if Poirot's words had cut deeper than anything she had imagined. She had played a part in this, and now the enormity of it seemed too much to bear. The feeling of being trapped caught in the web of someone else's schemes was suffocating. Ingrid Lindholm, ever composed, now looked shaken. "Are we to be judged forever by this?" she asked, her voice steadier than it should have been, given the context. "Will we ever be free of the shadow this has cast on us?" Poirot's gaze shifted toward her, and though his expression remained calm, there was an unmistakable understanding in his eyes. "You are not the first to be caught in the web of your own actions, Madame Lindholm. None of us are. But the question you must ask yourself now is not how long the shadow will linger, but whether you will live with it, or whether you will allow it to define you. The truth is a heavy burden, but it is also freeing, for it strips away the lies and the masks we wear." Poirot's words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. The room, once filled with the quiet hum of suppressed emotions, had now become a chamber of reflection. The guests had nowhere to hide. No more distractions, no more illusions. They had all been complicit in some way, each one of them a player in a larger drama that none of them had fully understood. But the time for excuses had passed. The truth was out, and with it came the responsibility of facing the consequences. "We are left with only one thing now," Poirot said, his voice quiet but resolute, "to confront ourselves, to understand that the choices we make, no matter how small they seem, have the power to change everything." He turned to face the door, his steps measured, as though he had already made up his mind. "I will leave you now, Mzamas. The truth has been revealed. What you do with it is no longer my concern." As Poirot walked toward the door, the guests remained in their seats, each lost in the deep waters of their own reflections. The case was over, but the real work had just begun. And for them, the journey toward redemption or regret would be a far longer road than any of them had anticipated. Chapter 17, Outcome and Justice. As Poirot made his way from the room, leaving behind the guests to contemplate their fates, he could sense the quiet storm that brewed in the aftermath of the case. The finality of his revelations had left them speechless. But it was not his words that had brought the most profound change. No, it was the truth itself. The truth that cut through the layers of lies and fears each of them had been carrying for so long. The guests were left behind, immobilized by their own thoughts, each struggling with the weight of their complicity in the tragedy that had unfolded within those walls. There was no escaping it now. They had all been caught in a web of their own making, and though Duval had confessed to the murder, the true consequences were yet to be fully realized. Lady Marlowe sat motionless, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She was the first to speak, her voice trembling but determined. "Poirot was right," she whispered, almost to herself. "We all had something to hide, something to lose, and we all allowed it to happen." Catherine Durand looked up from her hands, where she had been nervously wringing the fabric of her dress. "We were all part of this, but I never imagined it would lead to a death." Her voice caught as she spoke, guilt weighing heavy in every syllable. "I thought I could protect myself. I thought I could keep the truth hidden." Ingrid Lindholm, who had remained quiet for the most part, let out a long, shaky breath. "None of us can pretend we didn't have a role in this. We knew what Madame Zoraia was capable of, and still, we allowed her to manipulate us. We allowed our own fears to rule us. Double quotes. Dr. Ekstrom, who had been sitting with his face in his hands, looked up slowly. But she didn't deserve to die, he muttered. No one deserves that. Not even someone like her. The words were heavy in the room. Each guest had, in some way, justified their actions, whether by fear or desperation. But now they could not deny the consequences. Madame Zoraya's death had been the culmination of their collective choices, their collective failures, and now, with Duval in custody, they were left to grapple with the damage they had caused. Lady Marlowe stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need to speak with Poirot," she said, her voice firm but tinged with a sense of urgency. "I need to understand why he left us like this, why he didn't give us any answers." As if on cue, Poirot re-entered the room, his presence commanding and unassuming all at once. He met her gaze but did not speak immediately. His silence was both a challenge and an invitation. The tension that had once filled the room now crackled with the unspoken weight of all that had transpired. "You wanted to speak with me, Madame Marlowe?" Poirot asked quietly, his eyes fixed on her. There was no warmth in his tone, no pity, just a sharp clarity that cut through the room. Lady Marlowe took a deep breath before speaking again. "What happens now? Will Duval be punished? Will there be any consequences for the rest of us? You've shown us the truth, but what do we do with it? We can't go back. We can't undo what we've done." Poirot stood still for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the guests. "Justice, madam, is not always about punishment. It is about acknowledging the truth and understanding the consequences of one's actions. Monsieur Duval has confessed. He will face the consequences of his crime. As for the rest of you," Poirot let the words hang in the air, heavy with meaning, "none of you took an active hand in the murder. But you all allowed it to happen," Poirot continued, his voice calm but firm. "You let your fears and your desires cloud your judgment. You were complicit by inaction, by silence, and by the secrets you kept from one another." Dr. Ekstrom shifted in his seat, his face dark with guilt. "But how do we move on from this?" he asked. "How do we live with the weight of our choices?" Poirot's gaze softened, just slightly. "You live with it by accepting responsibility. You face the truth, as difficult as it may be, and you understand the impact of your actions. It is not enough to confess to yourself. It is the actions that follow the confession that truly matter." Catherine Durand looked up, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Will we ever be forgiven? Can we ever redeem ourselves?" Poirot took a step forward, his voice gentle yet resolute. "Forgiveness is something that must come from within. It is not something I can grant. But redemption, Mademoiselle Durand, is not an easy path. It requires true change, the courage to confront your past, and to make amends where possible. But that, too, is your responsibility." The room fell silent once again, the weight of Poirot's words settling over them. The detective's final revelation had not come in the form of a grand unveiling, but in the quiet acceptance of the guests' roles in the tragedy. Duval was in custody, and the consequences of his crime would follow. But for the others, the hardest part was yet to come, the journey inward, towards self-reflection and understanding. Poirot turned to leave, but before he did, he spoke one last time. "The truth is a burden," he said quietly, "but it is also a gift. It is up to you how to use it." And with that, he exited the room, leaving the guests alone with their thoughts, their guilt, and the slow, painful process of understanding what had led them to this point. The case was closed, but for them, the work of redemption had only just begun. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The guests sat in the silence left in Poirot's wake, each wrapped in the bitter weight of the detective's final words. They had been left to confront the aftermath of their own actions, without the luxury of forgiveness or immediate resolution. It was a somber, almost suffocating atmosphere. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, as though it, too, had absorbed the guilt and remorse that now filled the space. Lady Marlowe was the first to stir, her face pale and drawn, her movements slow as if the weight of the evening had taken its toll. She glanced at the others, her eyes flickering with the realization that nothing in her life would ever be the same again. She had invited Madame Zoraia into their midst, believing it would be a harmless bit of entertainment. Now it was clear that the woman had been the catalyst that had sparked a chain of events, pulling everyone into a web of deceit and fear. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling as she broke the heavy silence. "Do we simply wait for the inevitable?" Catherine Durand shifted in her seat, her face still pale, the weight of the last hours pressing down on her. "I don't know if I can live with this," she murmured, looking up at the others with a mix of vulnerability and guilt. "I knew, even then, that I was hiding something, but I never thought it would lead to something like this." Ingrid Lindholm, who had remained eerily composed throughout the ordeal, now spoke with a quiet bitterness in her voice. "We were all complicit, weren't we? Each of us, in our own way. And now, here we are broken, uncertain, and waiting for whatever punishment will come. We can't undo what we've done, and no amount of regret will change that." Dr. Ekstrom, who had been the most visibly shaken since Poirot's revelations, let out a long sigh. "But we never meant for any of this," he said softly. "None of us wanted Zoraia to die. We only wanted to protect ourselves from the truth she was threatening to reveal." Lady Marlowe looked at him, her eyes tired but searching. "But is that any excuse?" she asked, her voice low and thoughtful. "Can we really justify our actions by saying we were afraid? Or does that just make us more guilty in the end?" There was no immediate answer, no simple resolution. Each guest sat lost in their own thoughts, the sting of Poirot's words still fresh in their minds. They had each acted out of fear, out of desperation. But in the end, it was not the act of murder that defined their guilt, it was the way they had allowed themselves to be manipulated, to be drawn into the game of secrets and lies that Madame Zoraia had orchestrated. Poirot had given them the truth, but now the real challenge was to live with it, to live with the consequences of their inaction, their lies, and their fear. The justice that they all awaited would come, but not in the form they might have hoped. It was not up to Poirot to decide their fates. He had already done his part. Now it was their responsibility to reckon with what had been revealed. As the clock on the mantelpiece ticked away the moments, the weight of time pressed down on the room, its steady rhythm reminding them that their past actions could not be undone. What remained was the slow and painful process of living with the truth. Finally, Lady Marlowe stood, her eyes scanning the room as she took in the faces of those who had been a part of this tragedy. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, but for the first time that evening, she did not flinch. She understood now, perhaps more than anyone, that the truth could be as much a burden as it was a gift. "We must face the consequences," she said quietly, her voice stronger than it had been before. "There is no turning back now, but we can at least live with some sense of honor, knowing that we've confronted what we did, and why we did it." Catherine looked up at her, a faint but grateful smile tugging at her lips. "You're right," she said softly. "The truth is the only thing we have left now, and it's the only thing that can set us free." Poirot's words echoed in their minds once more, a final reminder of what had transpired. The truth is a burden, but it is also a gift. It is up to you how to use it. As the guests stood and slowly made their way toward the door, each one of them seemed lost in thought. The truth had been revealed, and while the detective had solved the case, it was the guests who had to deal with the aftermath, the realization that their actions had consequences, that the lives they had touched had been irrevocably changed, would be something they would carry with them for the rest of their days. The game had ended. The players had been exposed. Now, all that remained was to face the consequences of the choices they had made, and the price they would pay for their involvement in the tragedy.